Welcome back to another episode of the 706 podcast, the podcast where we discuss, debate, and argue which movies are the 706 greatest films of all time. I'm your host today, Anthony, and we are, in no particular order,
Tony.
I knew that was going to happen. I'm Kirk.
Yeah, all at the same time.
Cool. Well, we'll work on that later. Let's see. So today's film is a sort of underrated and forgotten cult classic from 1941 called Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles. It is a film in which we are essentially told a sort of story or flashback, a discovery of trying to uncover the meaning behind a certain word, rosebud, through the life of a man fictionalized, partially based on a real newspaper tycoon named William Hearst, but fictionalized for our film as Charles Foster Kane. So this is an interesting film because I think, one, it may be the most popular movie we've done on this podcast, not necessarily in terms of cultural value, but in terms of lasting value, it certainly ranks pretty high. It is a film that's consistently at the top, if not always at the top, of many of the best of all time lists. Although I think someone said last time, and I may agree with them, this may not even be Orson Welles' best film. And yet, it has a kind of weird mystique in film culture, has a weird mystique as kind of a emblem of greatness to aspire to. It has a kind of myth and aura. Orson Welles being 25 when he directed this film is just a punch in the gut to every other young man out there. But just so much going for it, so much to talk about, so many different directions. But what we need to start with, I think, is our first takes, or in some cases, second or third takes, depending on how many times we've watched this. But I think we should start with Kirk, if that's okay. Kirk, is very excited. He has his notes out. He's been studying this film for weeks, but
He wrote his college thesis on this film, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but this actually is his first time watching it, which is the interesting fact. So, Kirk, do you want to share your opinion, your thoughts?
Well, I'm worried that I'm going to step into it and there's going to, I'm going to say something and then you guys are going to come back and you're like, you didn't catch the alien invasion in Act 2. That was, a syllogism for X and Y. I don't know. This film feels like it feels kind of like going to a Smithsonian museum. You're going to see things you've already seen. They're going to have, I would say, cultural importance, cinematic importance, but I guess if I continue the metaphor, they're going to have historical importance to our nation, to our collective society, and you're not necessarily going to be surprised. And at the end of the day, you're going to walk out feeling somewhat tired and ready for a more lively experience, perhaps at the nice local DC eateries or bars, because it does feel like you're kind of walking, you're in Xanadu. Like this film feels like kind of its own Xanadu in the sense of it feels impersonal in certain ways. Like I felt detached from the characters at times. And I know that's all purposeful, and I know everything I could say could have a counterpoint. So I'm just going to really focus on my subjective experience of this film. I'm not the biggest classics guy to begin with, classic film. And I know this is kind of like top of the mountain. And I don't really understand that because I enjoy so many others more than this. I don't even know. I can't even really think of many classic films that I enjoy less, to be honest. This film didn't leave any real lasting impression on me. I mean, it was kind of an obligatory thing. I mean, it was for the podcast, but also just for like my cinematic edification, right? Like that's kind of why I chose it. And I guess I was hoping for a transcendent experience. I never really got it. You kind of got into the flow a little bit, though it does start very kind of, like jolts around and you're not really afforded the ability to gain much flow until maybe like the second act and you kind of understand the beats. The writing is spot on. I mean, the writing is very snappy. Some really great lines. Old age is the only disease man doesn't want to be cured of, stuff like that. That's just kind of really catches your ear. The acting is fairly decent. I wouldn't say there were any like astounding performance. I mean, Orson Welles, yeah, he did a fairly good job here. I mean, I think everything is in cinema is potentiated by makeup and by aging effects, and that makes it feel like there's more of a transformation than there actually was. I don't know. It's really kind of it's a story about America, about our collective understanding of what we're striving towards, who we value in society. It's an indictment of certain aspects of our society. I like the idea that, this person wished to be adored and they tried to buy love, and it was purely transactional, and the loneliness that comes with accumulating resources as almost tokens for human affection. It was very obvious that the mother piece was kind of attached to Rosebud the whole time. I don't even think it was necessary for them to, given the snow globe and how it was of a snowy cabin, I don't even think it was necessary for them to show the sled, but I guess it was important for them to have that almost Vatican feel of the black smoke coming out the chimney as almost like a cremation of his past. And so I guess, yeah, it's like it's cultural, but it's also intrapsychic in the idea of like the power of memory, the kind of inescapable dread that comes from knowing that we can never really know another person. But I guess that's also kind of freeing in a way. So yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it, but I just wasn't really that entertained, to be honest. I don't know. I mean, you look at a film like It's a Wonderful Life, and that has flashbacks and kind of it goes back and forth, and it just felt like it's more congealed. Like I don't know, maybe it's not for the true like diehard cinema, scholars, but I don't know. I feel like I appreciate films that have a certain shape to them, like a defined shape. And this film, and it also dragged at times. There were, like the opera scene, it just went on too long. And I get it. Like, I understand that this is supposed to signify that he's trying to will, something to happen. He's trying to will himself to be this figure of importance in society, and he's using who is it, Candace? I forget the name of his second wife as this kind of token. And my final comment will be that my viewing also suffered from probably unfair expectations going into it. The idea that this was supposed to be the best film of all time is certainly not the best film of all time. I would love to talk with somebody who believes that to be true and just hear what they have to say, and how many nitrous oxide whipped cream chargers they've taken right before they start explaining why it's the best film, because they must be high. I can't think of one thing this film does better than any other film. Maybe it's just everything is like second best, and then that B average makes it the best by like an aggregation. But yeah. So Connor, he said overrated. Maybe he was actually making a play on how somebody like me might react to it. But I do feel like this book was overrated. I don't know why it was chosen of all the classic films, and I'm sure you will explain that to me. And I come from a place of relative ignorance regarding its history and its place in film history. So I hope to learn more about that. I hope to have a nice candid discussion of what you all feel. But that's my initial impression. Some 30 minutes after finishing Citizen Kane for the first time in my life at 32 years old.
All right. Thank you, Kirk. It's really refreshing to have a kind of quick take on a kind of first viewing. And explicitly, your review sort of raises a number of different questions. Why do things have a kind of lasting impression, or why does this impression sustain itself after all these years? How are our modern sensibilities affecting that, or should they affect how we rank or view movies in terms of a kind of canon? A lot of things to get to, but we'll kind of move on for a second. I think next, Kirk, you said that you weren't a classics guy, but we have a classics guy here, a real classics man named Connor. And I believe, if I remember right, Connor, that last time you said you didn't believe Citizen Kane was Orson Welles' best film, which I may agree with you. But I want to know your take. Was this your second time seeing this, another one? And what did you have to say about it now?
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Kirk, for laying the groundwork and referring to what I said. Yeah, this idea that is it overrated? And I remember the very first time I watched it, I just didn't really get it. I was pretty young at the time, but I found it a little bit kind of boring. It kind of lost me. I just wasn't really ready, I think, to watch it. I must watch it again after that, but then I had a watching of it like maybe a couple years ago where I did really enjoy it. And I'm watching it again, and I was trying to watch it with a little bit of like a maybe slightly contrarian eye. You know, I said that probably it's overrated, right? I was kind of watching to try to like find, you know, the flaws in it and try to kind of, but I have to say, like, it's a very well made, you know, kind of flawless, so meticulously written and choreographed and blocked and photographed, you know, film. You know, I think obviously, like, the idea of a greatest movie of all time is kind of silly, right? There shouldn't be a greatest of all time. There are things that are good for certain people or good at certain things, right? We really have to qualify that adjective greatest, you know, greatest in what respect. But obviously, and I hope Anthony actually can illuminate a little bit, I think there's kind of somewhat arbitrary cultural reasons why this became just bandied about as, you know, if you had to pick a greatest movies of all time, not even based on people's own opinions, but it was the sense that it was a critical consensus. Whereas like maybe that wasn't really ever true, right? The idea is that this was consistently from 1962 to 2012, I think was like consistently rated the number one, you know, of critics polled in Sight and Sound. You know, they said this was, and obviously it had, I think, a kind of a small lead in 1962, and it kind of built and built and built as time went on. It became just this thing where the critics perceive that the other critics believe that this is the greatest. So it becomes this kind of critical mass sort of thing. I think it is kind of arbitrary. I don't think it has a lot to do. And maybe I could go as far as to say that it's almost as a disservice to the movie because we watch it in this strange light of like, the greatest film of all time. It just doesn't feel right to watch it in that light, I think. It just doesn't feel like it fits the bill. What it is, and I guess one reason it makes a claim to, right, is because I think in the 60s, it's kind of beginning of a kind of countercultural, you know, sort of feeling. I mean, the 62 would obviously be pretty early for that, but it's like this real kind of value of the kind of presaging new Hollywood, the kind of auteur, you know, perspective as opposed to the studio, you know, the struggle of Orson Welles against the studio, right? So this is kind of an example of this, like, you know, pure creation of a young artiste who did everything he could, who put all of his ideas in the film, and look how great it turned out to be. Like, this is what happens when we let artists, you know, do their own thing. We emancipate artists from the studio, from financial considerations, right? They can create amazing, you know, work. So I think it becomes kind of a totem, you know, a token for that kind of view. And no, I mean, and I think there's something to that, the way this movie is made. I think, you know, we were talking when we watched Heathers. We described Heathers as kind of this like young man's movie, this kind of ostentatious, kind of very witty, very, in some ways, kind of pretentious in its way, but also very knowing and very self-aware. We compared it to like the movies that it was essentially was kind of like a parody of. It was kind of a reaction against. That is like the John Hughes, like Breakfast Club, like those kinds of teen films. I get a similar feeling when I watch Citizen Kane. It feels like Heathers in that, or Heathers feels like Citizen Kane in that it's very up its own ass in a way. It's very like, it thinks it's very, very smart. Every character is written like, you know, Mankiewicz, who was one of the writers, or Wells. They all kind of talk in the same smooth way that Wells in fact did talk. You know, it's ostentatious and maybe a bit like heavy-handed, and it's kind of, this idea of like, well, he was a communist, he was a fascist. How are we going to understand who this mystery of the man, of Kane, when it's like, obviously it's like, well, no, you can figure out more or less who he is. He's not that much of a mystery. Everyone is complicated, obviously, but I don't think the movie necessarily follows through. Like, the mystery of Kane is not that deep. I mean, the Rosebud thing, maybe, but it's like, he doesn't strike me as a particularly contradictory person, even though I think the really great inner conflict that's depicted is, for instance, his push and pull of how he ultimately writes the bad review of his own wife, that I think is very deep and very interesting. But that's not like a thing about the complicatedness or the inability of understanding a man. It's just that, yes, people are complicated and they have like complicated drives. But I think, it's ostentatious, but how can you fault something like, how can you not love? Maybe someone wouldn't love it. How can you not just gasp at that moment where he's outside of this newspaper thing and we see him looking at a picture of the staff and they're saying like, well, that's the best staff of any paper in the world. Like, you're never going to be able to, you're not in 10 years you're going to be able to build like a staff like that. And then it cuts to, we're looking at the picture, Kane walks into the picture, and then it's like he's announcing that he's just hired all of these, like, that is the like coolest thing, and it is punctuated musically with the flash of the light bulb. I mean, it's like, it's unbelievably amazing. To me, it is very entertaining. It is very moment to moment thrilling, but it's when it's trying to think about this movie as not just an amazing kind of tour de force of cinematic bravura or kind of cinematic sleight of hand and tricks and new techniques and exuberant kind of playfulness. It's when it kind of tries to be very like heavy-handed and very deep that it kind of loses me a little bit. I think again, it just doesn't feel like it quite matches up to that. But I have to say, I mean, it's such a well executed film, and it's still such a fun and stylish film. I mean, it still holds up. This is from 1941. It really doesn't feel like it. It feels very fresh still. So that's my take.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Connor. I think just before we get to Tony, not to step on any of his shoes if he had anything to say, but just because you and Kirk, brought up the kind of history, I think it is kind of important to keep in mind a couple of things here, just very briefly, which is one, in terms of the kind of reception and its kind of history as the greatest movie, which, as Connor was saying, is true only to 1962 in the Sight and Sound list, which of course is a UK-based publication, a major film publication. But a couple things to keep in mind is one, Orson Welles, his reputation as a kind of auteur of many different mediums, before the film and long after it, not just successful in film, but a successful actor, a successful director at a very young age, successful in radio, potentially a very successful author, all sorts of things going for him that make him seem like, oh, he's giving his talents to film. I think certainly plays in his youth, his fight against Hearst, and the kind of publicity of this movie all adds to this kind of aura around the kind of drive of the artist. I think Connor's onto something. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is we tend to think back about 1941 of this movie coming out as, the sort of punk rock being invented type moment. Yeah, it was kind of mildly critically received well. It, of course, had a huge influence on a lot of filmmakers and people in film in terms of their craft. You can't deny that. But the idea it changed everything overnight, I think, is sort of overblown. We'll keep in mind is that the major film critics of the 40s and 50s actually disliked the movie. James Agee, W.H. Oden, whole list of kind of prominent names at the time really disregard it. It's not until the mid to late 50s that the film actually starts undergoing a kind of critical renaissance. And that's, of course, because of the kind of group of French New Wave critics that eventually come to prominence in the 60s. Godard, Truffaut, Romay, huge list of names that absolutely love Citizen Kane. They're seeing this in Paris. They're seeing this without knowing English. So they're watching this movie the way they thought movies should be made, which is to be able to be understood solely through the visuals. So all this writing's coming out, and people are responding to these French people thinking about movies seriously in a kind of deeper, more interesting way that I think has another kind of hidden, more subtle influence that we don't recognize in terms of people agreeing this is the best movie. And of course, by the time we get to the late 60s, this movie is actually still pretty rare. It's not commonly seen. Peter Bogdanovich actually puts the first Orson Welles retrospective in New York as a young man. He's like 23 or something like that, but he puts it on. It's the first time people are really seeing Citizen Kane in the US. And this is New York only. We'll keep that in mind. But this is one of the first times they're seeing Citizen Kane since it really came out. It wasn't playing on TV all the time. But the important thing here is other directors are hearing about this. This movie's playing at the MoMA. Orson Welles, this great guy who's still alive, who's mentoring young directors. Peter Bogdanovich, a young auteur in the late 60s, early 70s. Martin Scorsese, they all talk about hearing how this movie was playing at the MoMA and other theaters, and they just wanted to see it. So, of course, there's people thinking about this movie without even having seen it, which is kind of an interesting other element to think. But I think all that kind of plays a drive in the culture. It's kind of a brief history lesson on that reception, which we can maybe get into a little bit more later, but I don't want to cut Tony short. Let's get Tony's opinion, who I know you said you actually saw this in the theater pretty recently as well.
I actually was at that screening at the MoMA in 1968. I sat right next to Martin Scorsese, and I know for a fact that he hated it. So don't listen to anything he says. He's a poser. He's trying to impress everybody. No, well, I gotta say, guys, very, very impressed. The amazing comments so far on this intimidating film. And I wasn't aware of that kind of history in terms of it really being the 60s in terms of when it developed that kind of title of the greatest movie of all time, which I agree with Connor is sort of like a burden as much as anything. You know, I feel like Orson Welles would, I don't know how he felt about that, but he may have had very complicated feelings about that. Like, that's an amazing honor, but it also kind of prevents people from actually seeing this movie for what it is, because you're always going to have that lens and that reputation, which no movie could live up to. I don't care what movie it is. No movie's going to be the greatest of all time, because there's no greatest of all time. That's impossible. You know, it's ultimately subjective. But I think in addition to everything you guys have said, I feel like this movie represents sort of almost a coming of age for cinema. Sounds like a strong word, but like just sort of in terms of like the variety of techniques it uses and the assurance with which it uses them, telling this story, a story that could only be told in film in a cinematic way. Like, this had to be a movie. You couldn't make a play of Citizen Kane. You couldn't make a book of Citizen Kane. You couldn't do it in any other narrative form. This is an incredibly like cinematic experience. And just like, even like the way it opens when you're seeing the fades on Xanadu, and it's very eerie and kind of dreamlike. And then he drops the snow globe, and then you see the nurse walk in reflected in the snow globe. And it's just like a dream. It feels so fluid. The whole movie is constantly like moving. A lot of old films are kind of almost stage play like, or like you'll have a set and you'll have a kind of a setup and you have actors playing out scenes. It doesn't mean there wasn't camera movement. You know, camera movement existed for decades at this point, but you rarely see camera movement as fluid and as assured as in Citizen Kane. There are shots in this movie that to this day, I don't 100% know how they got them. I mean, I'm sure it's not magic. You can look it up. I mean, they had less resources than we do today, but there's shots in this movie that are incredible. Like the first flashback to when he's a little kid and you see the camera pull back through the window. That every time I see this movie and I see that shot, I'm like, wow, that's a good shot. And just there's so many amazing transitions and fades, just things like Connor said, just the choreography of cinema, the way a camera will pan just so that a character's right where they need to be in the frame, so it fades into the next shot. And it's just remarkably assured. The fact that I don't believe that language is violence, but the fact that when Anthony said he was 25 when he made this film, that is violence. That is a violent thing he did to me by saying that, because I knew he was young, but it is so upsetting because, man, this is I remember Mark Maron called No Country for Old Men and There Will Be Blood big dick movies. This is the original like big dick movie. I think this is it. This is coming to play and just showing what you got and leaving it all on the table. And he did. And just the fact of playing Kane himself. And I think it is an amazing performance. I mean, yes, obviously there's the makeup and the aging effects that do some heavy lifting, but I think he really does undergo kind of a physical transformation in terms of how he walks, how he moves around. And I love seeing young Kane and just how incredibly charismatic, full of life, and how vibrant he is, and how loathsome and decrepit he becomes. I think it's a genuinely great performance. And And yeah, and I find this movie entertaining just in terms of its movement, its cadence, the fact that it's always moving, that we're always going through new things. And I think that this movie is actually very meta and very clever in a lot of ways. Like, this to me is a movie about narratives and how we try to capture reality. The fact that it opens with a newsreel. I mean, I think the construction of this movie is incredibly clever and well thought out. Like, just like, this is not like a biopic about William Randolph Hearst. This is not just a story of a man's life. This is a story of other people telling the story of a man's life. It opens with this newsreel montage, which is basically the entire movie. Like, the movie just basically opens up like giving us like the narrative events of his life in like fast motion in like a couple minutes, very economically. And then we have people watching it in the theater, this incredibly meta moment, and people saying like, well, what was that about? You know, what are we doing here? Like, what does Rosebud mean? Come on. And it does this thing where all the extended flashbacks to Kane's life are stories that other people are telling. And the first time this happens, the first time we cut back to the journalist reading the memoir in the library, it almost takes you aback. You forgot that we were in a flashback. We forgot that he was reading a book. So we're really getting this like second and sometimes third hand information. So I would say that I do think the movie does deliver on the promise of presenting a person that it's impossible to know, because yes, the movie presents kind of an argument for who Kane was, but at the end of the day, we can't really trust anything we see because we're just hearing what other people thought about him. Do we really think that his ex-wife, who had a terrible relationship with him, do we really think that those stories are 100% how he was? Was he really that monstrous in that relationship? I don't know that he was, and none of us can. And that's the entire point of the movie. At the end of the day, all we have is smoke and ash going into the air. And that's all it ever amounted to in a single word, Rosebud, which again, who knows? Is that even the same sled as the beginning of the movie? We don't know. The fact is we don't know. And it's just trying to impose a narrative that makes sense onto a person who is infinitely complicated and infinitely unknowable, the same way every other human being is. So I think the movie is remarkably meta and remarkably clever in that respect. And yeah, just the fact that it's about a newspaper man too. It's about narratives. And the movie's constantly referencing this theme of like creating reality through narratives. Like, Kane seems to believe that he can make reality in his own image. Like, if he says, I'll give you your war, you know, and his media influence actually affects real world historical events. You know, we're told at least that he affects the election of a US president, for example. And he says, if the headline's big enough, it makes the news big enough, which is a meta statement of intent by Wells, of course, you know, for the film. If I make the headline big enough, if I use the most dazzling techniques, the most dazzling performances, the most dazzling technology, it will make it a story worth telling. And it almost seems like a wry joke at like the substance of the film almost is irrelevant. It's almost like an afterthought to Wells here. But yeah, I mean, that's it. There are other little notes from it, but no, I think this is a great movie. I think this movie, like, again, is it the greatest of all time? No, because no movie can be, but I can understand why critics of a certain generation would champion this as the greatest movie of all time. I really admire this movie and am in awe of what Wells was able to create. And I find movies like this to be tremendously inspiring, you know, and I do think that it feels more current than 1941. It's more technically impressive than a lot of modern films, I would argue, maybe even most in certain ways. So anyway, I'm pro Citizen Kane. Very hot take. I'm really staking out a stance here, but I'm gonna say it's good. Citizen Kane is good.
All right. Thank you, Tony. A lot of good points there. A lot of good things to unravel. A lot of things that I'm sure Kirk will want to respond to maybe as we go forward or not. But, you know, just as for my own thing and kind of a quick response to you, Tony, is one is at least, you know, in the public, Orson Welles, you know, comes off as a sort of Hemingway type figure, very arrogant, very egotistical about his own kind of approach to film and his own kind of creativity in it. But he did say, and this is one of my favorite remarks he's ever said, is Citizen Kane is certainly a great film, but The Stranger is my best film. That's what I should be remembered for. Of course, which comes out in the 60s with Anthony Perkins, a pretty good film, very stylistically interesting in its own way. That's a great argument, though, for someone to have that Stranger's better. But a couple of things. So Citizen Kane, I think we all nailed the kind of the key thing about this movie is it's kind of like trying to read Ulysses and someone reading the last line. It's spoiled for you. It's out there. You know, you're never going to be able to kind of get that fresh viewing. And yet, I think, like many people, that first time, because of that weight of that expectation that Kirk was discussing, I was similarly let down that first time. I think I saw it, you know, given in kind of shitty circumstances. I was watching it on like a computer, a Dell computer in like 2011 when I was in high school. And, you know, this was like a kind of horrible print DVD for the library that I was kind of inspecting as a volunteer for it. Not ideal circumstances, bored, a little tired, didn't kind of work for me. I thought it was outdated and old. And it wasn't until a couple years later when I revisited it that all of a sudden different things were starting to speak to me. And then again, about 3 or 4 months ago, I decided just to put it on. And I felt like a whole different level was kind of being approached in this movie that I hadn't recognized before, which may be a kind of recognition that you need to age for this movie. You kind of have to be a certain age to kind of hopefully appreciate it. Maybe something kind of awakened in me that's different. Maybe Kirk isn't quite mature yet for the movie. But I want to start just quickly with a couple scenes that I really love, which is one of my favorite moments in a film is with Bernstein, who's kind of one of the newspaper people. And he's discussing with the kind of reporter who it's important to keep in mind. The reporter is kind of our narrator, almost our key figure, who we never actually see the face of in clear light. It's always almost disguised in this kind of double indemnity type light. We never get a clear view. But he sits down to talk to Bernstein. And Bernstein gives a short little anecdote about seeing a girl with a parasol. It's one of my favorite moments in which he discusses one day seeing this girl with a parasol, remarking on her. And to this day, he bets there's not a month goes by when he hasn't thought about her. And it's just such a striking moment about, I think, the way male memory works, that they're constantly looking for these kind of nostalgic moments, longing for chances to repeat something, wishing for alternate histories or alternate visions of life to play out. And it just doesn't happen. Yet that longing is always there. And I think that's one of the kind of key markers for the film. The other thing I want to bring up is one day, and this kind of goes to what Kirk was saying in terms of the reception of the movie, the idea of greatness. This goes back to a kind of contemporary review from the time in which a great writer, Borges, actually gave a very critically negative review of the film, calls it brilliant, calls it a metaphysical detective story, which I think gives some hint at what Tony was talking about, the kind of postmodern meta nature of this. It's a story about media, a story about narratives, but he also calls it, very interestingly, a labyrinth with no center. And I think that's kind of a great way to think about the movie. Once again, as Tony was saying, the different narrators, that we're viewing a man that we never really get to know. We're viewing a man that other people think they got to know or think they had approaches to knowing, but it never really feels quite correct. It's only in instances of thinking about it do we get kind of glimpses. It's only in these kind of stories like that guy dreaming about the parasol that we're kind of getting little dreams themselves, dreams of who they thought Kane was. And in little moments, we get these great flashes. Kane as the monster, Kane as a kind of heroic man leading a kind of newspaper charge. And at the same time, in our kind of current sensibility, how brave is some of that? Hearing him talk about the news, hearing him talk about how he needs to give a voice to the little people, doesn't that feel a little odd, a little strange, and a little creepy at times? Yes, there's Trumpian spins there, of course, but I mean, even just more general, it's kind of odd. It's a little different. I think it's a brilliant depiction of what it means to want to do something, to have people who support you and don't quite see some of the nefarious evil underneath it, which is one thing. And a final point is, I think one of the things I really take away from this movie is the way that we all desire certain memories, or we all desire certain memories that other people should have of us. And they're never quite in our control, that they're always kind of slipping away. They're always kind of disappearing. And so when I get to the kind of ending of Rosebud, I don't necessarily go, oh shit, it's a sled, great. I see something kind of a deeper, I see something really longing, and I see Charles Foster Kane as, at the end of the day, not necessarily a complicated person, but as someone people want to make complicated because they never really got to know him. What I see is actually still just that kind of quiet, scared little boy who's taken away from his family, who do believe they're giving him a better future, but at the same time rob him of really any kind of personal dignity and kind of personal hope, which I think is a really tragic commentary about the way money kind of works. But anyway, I could keep going on. There's a lot of things to say, a lot of potentially negative things at the same time. Yes, the movie's not perfect. Sometimes the makeup does feel odd, feels old. Sometimes acting is a little stagey at times. But to me, it overall works. And I am similarly to Tony, pro Citizen Kane. But I think, we should step back in the next kind of 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and go to maybe some of the faults, as Kirk was saying. Kirk, you described the movie as kind of something that other films were more interesting to you. Was it the weight of that greatness, or the kind of commentary of it? Was it just kind of the story itself? Did these other things that Tony, Connor, and I found not speak to you? Was it a young man's movie? Do you want to expand on anything?
Yeah, well, I feel like there's been a whole lot of subtweeting going on in the few interactions we've had in the last 10 minutes, 20 minutes. I will say, Tony, to your point, I very much appreciate the innovative cinematic strategy of having shitty dubbing done throughout the film. I thought that was really great. I thought it was like something I could never have imagined being carried over into the future. And I still haven't seen it done as well, when he's moving his mouth and nothing's coming out, and then words happen 2 minutes later. But never mind. That actually, I mean, that's like a real thing that happened in that puzzle scene in Xanadu. He's and then we're not going anywhere, sweetie. But you can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh well, it's part of its time, but then you can highlight all the great aspects of it that transcend into the day. So I mean, it's like, it's a little idealized in that sense. But yeah, I don't know, guys. I don't think it's a lack of immaturity for me. I think it's a need for connection. I wanted the mother-son relationship fleshed out. I'm getting Blue Velvet flashbacks here, where it's like every complaint I have was purposefully done, was purposefully crafted by Orson Welles. Yeah, and I'm also getting a little cachet flashbacks too. But okay, what I will say is it's an interesting novel idea to kind of play with the intersubjectivity of narrators influenced by ulterior motives. I think that is quite clever. For me, yeah, it feels like a mile wide and a couple inches deep in a sense. Whenever I want something to develop further, whenever I want a scene to last longer, like for instance, the scene where he comes home with his first wife, and it was after a late night of socializing, it cuts right away to them presumably like 3 months later, and they have another interaction that's 2 seconds long, and then maybe a year later and they have another 10-second interaction, then 2 years. And it's like, you don't have time to establish, you don't have time to lower your anchor, because you're on to the next like fucking atoll. And it just feels like you're jet setting through all these cinematic obstacles and kind of showpieces. And I don't know. Also, we never saw any further mention of his son dying in a car crash, which was kind of strange, because you would feel like that would be one of the biggest, most traumatic moments of his life. But I'm not sure what happened there. So I guess, I have to give more credence to the theory of like, yeah, these are unreliable narrators with their own kind of ulterior motives. So that's truly fair. And yeah, in my first recounting, I did underplay, like I could see a lot of the cinematic qualities at play. I'm more of a story focused person, and surely motion focused. And so kind of a lot of it just left me wanting, and in that sense, maybe I'm less than, I'm not sure. Maybe it's just an impatience, right? Or just unfair expectations. But I think it could benefit from a second viewing, for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say. A movie that kind of popped up in my head when we're like, you see the old mansions, like kind of like Sunset Boulevard. And yeah, I found an emotional resonance in all these other films from the 50s and 60s and 40s even, that I didn't really find here. So the bag of tricks kind of is, in my humble opinion, like a consolation prize for me, because when ultimately I wish to be moved when I go see a film, and I wasn't necessarily moved in this film. So
All right. Well, interesting. I mean, we need a clarification expansion, Kirk. So nice. Connor, I saw you kind of nodding your head when I was talking about the parasol scene. Did you want to add anything to that, or did you want to talk about anything in particular?
Oh, I like that for some reason. I don't know. I can relate. No, it's funny just how he says, like, well, you might think, Rosebud, like could be some silly thing like an old, lover, but you'd be surprised as an old man, like the kinds of things you remember. But no, that's a very sweet, very touching little moment. But I kind of want to back Kirk up here, because even though I overall like the film a lot, and I would, I'm ultimately going to say yes, I think I can't really critique it very deeply. I think it deserves a pretty high place, obviously, if not the greatest film of all time. But like, think of, okay, the moments, an amazing sequence where there's this party they're having at the Enquirer, and now they've like reached this huge level of success. And it's this enormous, like, decadent party where these chorus girls come in and they sing a song that Kane like pretends like, oh, anyone could have a song written about. Anyway, so like they sing this song. There's this like song and dance number where even the characters are singing along. Like, it's this amazing mix of kind of, it's both surreal but also done kind of realistically and naturalistically. It is kind of a musical number within the film, but it feels as if it's kind of happening before our eyes. It doesn't feel necessarily like, it feels like it's happening for the characters and not just as a thing that's for us, But think of that moment where then there's supposed to be a serious moment in the middle of all of that song, singing and dancing, of Jedediah, his friend, sort of showing this kind of doubt. And in that moment, you literally, and there's supposed to be a moment between him and Bernstein, that kind of moment is lost. You feel like you can't even focus on that moment because there's so much crazy shit going on. There's so much, cuts and close-ups of all the different people in the crowd and all of these details and this crazy, choreography, literal choreography in the case of, and of course, as Tony would point out, and as Kirk might resent, that's the point, isn't it? Right? That you can't you don't have time to pay attention to, Kane kind of has us sort of deceived with all of his singing and dancing, with this kind of elaborate choreography, with this razzle dazzle. You don't even have time to, you could feel a little bit of doubt and uneasiness, but you don't have time to kind of approach that thing further. Okay, sure. All right. That's a little bit intended, but still, I think it is truly a flaw of the film that it has the ability to delve into, to stop with Bernstein and Jed and to talk that out and to spend more time on some of those issues. Like, for instance, the mom, as Kirk mentioned, you could totally delve into those things. It feels like things that, like, as if this were based on a novel, these were things that were kind of left on the cutting room floor, right? It's not in fact the case, but you know what I mean? I think you could delve into those things. The movie chooses not to, in the name of the bag of tricks, as Kirk was describing. And I want to fight one thing you guys were mentioning, which is this whole unreliable narrator concept. I find this a little like weird because it's like, it's not, I think, again, the Kane that we get is a fairly consistent guy. He was this poor kid who got this big break and he feels guilty about it. He lived basically the life of a rich kid. He tries to make up for that by espousing the cause of reform. But the truth is, in the end, he's a human being like anyone. He wants love, and he doesn't get it, right? Partially because he himself can't love because he has this chip on his shoulder. He didn't have the right start in life, et cetera, right? That is the story. And it's like, it's a complex and very human, like, psychology. It's not as if this is like Rashomon, where like the different Kanes appear different in different stories. I don't think that's true. I think you see the same Kane in all the different stories and all the different flashbacks, I would say. I'm sure he appears in a different light because it's at different stages in his life. But it feels to me very consistent. So I don't quite get like the mystery behind it, or I'm not with the movie and the fascination by the mystery of Kane. And I don't think that idea is quite as profound. Or I think Wells was kind of he was in embracing the kind of postmodern feeling and the kind of almost mixed media feeling of the film itself. He was kind of losing a little bit of the heart and losing a little bit of the man, at the center of the story, which is Kane. And obviously, yes, it's a little bit intentional, but I think it is a misstep. And this is why it is not his best film. maybe his greatest film, but not his best film, as he himself admitted.
Interesting. I think I'd pull back. I think I'd still side the fact as I don't really necessarily think they're fully consistent across stories. I would say the media, the montages are the moments where we actually get the most consistent Kane. And it's also revealing and sometimes pushing back against some of those consistencies we do see. I think one thing that's very fascinating is to think about the timeline of this movie. And there's one moment, where does Kane make his kind of newspaper name? It's in pushing US propaganda in the Spanish-American War, a kind of forgotten war, at least in our US history textbooks, but one of the most important, significant battles for the US. And yet, when we keep going a little further, would the Kane who does US propaganda for the Spanish-American War be the same Kane who reluctantly detracts certain materials from the newspaper and some of the other narratives? Sometimes to me, it feels a little off. I think we get a kind of hint of an honorific Kane in Leland's story, but I think we also get the withdrawn kind of differential one in his wife's, in the kind of weakening version from the servant. I think we do get slightly different Kanes, even though the ego, the ambition, I think is kind of consistent. But anyway, Tony, I know we're kind of stretching this pretty far, but or time wise, do you want to add anything or have anything to say?
No, dude, there's a lot of great points. I mean, I sort of see what Connor and Kirk are saying here. I think there's sort of and I think it is tough because I think that, the movie that does go into those things would be different. I do think that, yes, we can describe Kane as a character. He is there's a dramatic emotional core to his character in the movie. I think that Connor describes pretty well, but I agree with Anthony too, that there are subtle inconsistencies. And I do maintain my argument that they are unreliable narrators. But it is a weird kind of tension in the movie. I think I don't know if it resolves entirely successfully. And I agree with Kirk as well that it is odd that the death of his son is really not addressed at all. I mean, I could, feed that back into my reading of like the fact that that's omitted, what does that say? And I have a hard time believing that it was omitted accidentally. I feel like Orson Welles is way too meticulous to just have forgotten about it. But it's a curious choice, and it's not a choice I'm sure that I would have made or that I 100% agree with. But yeah, that's all I'll say. I'm going to do that.
All right, interesting. Well, I mean, we kind of talked a lot, throughout our introductions and whatnot. If we want to kind of move to voting, and then anyone wants to add anything else as they kind of go forward. Connor, do you want to start?
Sure. I don't have much else more to say. Again, it's one of those things where, sure, I think I agree with the flaws that Kirk cites, but yes, it's kind of seems to be part of the intent. Again, we can throw out the idea that it has to be the greatest film of all time. It just has to be, a uniquely not experimental, but there's this bravado to it. I'm thinking of somewhere that it's on the tip of my tongue that I can't remember. But anyway, it's this kind of technical exuberance. It's this kind of showing off, what he can do with the camera and with his actors and all that. And it does have a lot of heart. It has some incredible writing and incredible moments that are still very moving to me. When his second wife leaves him, how he reacts and then trashes the room. I mean, it's moving. It's effective. And just think of the moments of these kind of moments of verisimilitude, like the character of Jed, now in the nursing home, constantly trying to get the cigars, that kind of thing. And we're complaining about how the nurses aren't pretty, like people say, those moments are great. Right. And the writing, of course, is impeccable. And, so it's such a great achievement. How can I not say it's a yes? But again, I would say I like Touch of Evil personally more. I think it speaks more to me in its exuberance, and its, again, the word escapes me. It's kind of technical show-offiness. It lacks a little bit of heart that I think some of the studio pictures did have. When people were very on task and kind of restrained, I think you can kind of have that sometimes more. And it goes to show that kind of this auteur thing also brings with it a certain kind of yes, a wonderful kind of display of skill, but also a little bit of I think a lack of maturity, I guess. but he was 25 when he made it. So
Yeah, it's interesting.
Hold on a second. Hold on, Connor. Are you describing Orson Welles or Mike Jitloff? I'm confused.
well, of course, Chilov is the true Orson Welles of his time, not our time. But
If Orson Welles were born a few decades too late, he would be the tragic. Dylan will be the tragic result.
yeah, the Welles that no one ever saw.
Interesting. I think I'd agree with you, Connor. I do like Touch of Evil a bit more. I also like Magnificent Ambersons a lot too. But fascinating. If you also want to be sad, look up how old PTA was when he directed Boogie Nights. It's all great to have. But let's go to Kirk.
All right. Here comes the ceremonial walking back of all my hot-headed opinions, and I make amends to my co-hosts, and I say I'm sorry, and I sanitize my opinions. Here's the way I can. What's that, Connor? I didn't hear you.
Don't now do the rug pull and now say that you will not do that. You will not apologize.
Yes.
Here's where I apologize for. Yeah, I couldn't think of a clever thing, but it's a film. It is a film, and it's a good film. It is a good film. I think if I viewed it less as kind of a portrait of a man and looked at it more in terms of the processes of storytelling it's trying to convey and evoke, I think I can appreciate it more. So, it's a nice little lesson to be learned that you can't really try to pigeonhole a film just because of how it presents itself initially or because of what you want out of it. And I'm sure I bring a lot of that to the table. There's a lot of like counter transference going on. So a lot of projection. So yeah, it's almost like Wolf of Wall Street in that way. Maybe some of the similar complaints I have with that film, where it's less about the man. For me, I try to make it all about the man, but it might be less about morality and about the man and more about the society and the processes, these kind of intersections of information and subjectivity. So yeah, I'm not going to vote no I'll get canceled if I vote no. So I'm going to vote yes.
Have some courage, Kirk. Come on.
Yeah,
have some convictions.
No, I would regret it. If I voted no. I think it is good. And I think a second viewing can only go up, really. But, I will say in closing, it is no G.I. Jane 2.
All right. Well,
oh, shit. Oh, Will, I didn't mean it.
By the time this gets uploaded, that'll have happened 3 years ago.
Classic. Well, our fans are a bit disappointed. They're lacking the usual contrarian takes, but we'll see if Tony now switches gears after everything he said. What do you vote, Tony?
I mean, honestly, this movie isn't even good. I don't know what you guys even know. Yeah, no, and I'll say to piggyback on Connor, and by the way, just amazing comments, very incredibly thoughtful, the pros and the cons. But my favorite moment of writing is in the first flashback when he's a little boy, and his dad is like, we can't do this. Like, it's very like, passionately, like, we can't let our boy go, and we can't let a bank raise our son. And they're like, well, you'll get $50,000 a year for the rest of your life, which, if you don't know about inflation, that's $500 billion in today's money. That's more money than exists on earth in today's money. And he's like, oh, well, we'll hope for the best. And it's very cynical and very kind of it's like a very like blunt, cynical kind of moment, but it's very effective and very sad, and I think it works for what the satirical point he's kind of making. But this is definitely a yes for me. So
all right, so we got it in to the 706 greatest films of all time, the only list that matters. I think what's interesting is there were so many other things to talk about that we just didn't have time to, from the other characters. This is a movie that's not just about, Foster Kane, but about the others in so many different ways. But time's up. We'll move on to the favorite category, in which these three nominated film and I select the film to watch for our next episode. As always, we have our new gimmick in which if one person names a film from a certain decade, that decade is claimed and the others have to choose a different time or different decade, if I got that right. I don't remember who went least recent, but was it Connor?
Am I off?
I did Mass, then we did Tenet, then we did
Anthony's film
before.
Is it?
I think it's Connor.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm least. Okay. I'll probably go last, but I do want to say that I remember the word that escaped me. The word is aplomb. I have to let it be known I had the word aplomb. I wanted to use the word aplomb, and I just forgot it. How about Kirk goes first, then Tony, then myself?
All right, Anthony. I'm going to claim a decade that actually might ruffle some feathers in terms of, I don't know what Connor was hoping to select. I'm sure he's very versatile, but I'm going to choose the 60s, the 1860s. No, I am going to choose the Robert Wise directed Sound of Music, because this is more up my alley. This is I want to be in the Alps. I want to see Interlaken in the distance, or the Matterhorn, or I don't know, all those Austrian places. And I want to sing from the depths of my soul. And no, I think also the use of color in the Sound of Music is a very interesting thing to behold, and part of its timelessness. And it's almost like there's this contrasting nature where the Sound of Music is so kind of naturally beautiful and it's timeless for that, whereas you look at Citizen Kane, it's so stark, monochromatic, and dramatic in that sense. Two very contrasting styles, but both work in their own ways. And I think it does speak obviously to the decades in which they were formed and which they, were popularized as well. So great music. How many musicals have we done? I mean, 0? No, we did Crybaby. So this will be number 2. But Julie Andrews, don't think she's been on the pod. She's a friend of the pod. We'd love to see Julie. And yeah, I mean, this is just a nostalgia bomb. And if you're in the mood, it's kind of one of those things. And I'll sing the intro too. So
all right, classic. We always want to hear Kirk sing. The fans demand it. The fans plea for it, but it hasn't happened yet. So that's in the Sound of Music's corner. Tony, what do you got?
I got something different. I'm going to claim the 90s, and I'm going to pitch one of my all-time favorite movies, a movie I've watched maybe more than any other movie. I think I've watched this more than any other movie. This is Being John Malkovich by Spike Jonze, written by Charlie Kaufman. This is one of my absolute all-time favorite movies. I show this movie to like everybody. It gets a mixed reaction. Like my girlfriend was very much not a fan when I showed her this movie. So it's all right. It's fine. For those who are unfamiliar, this is a movie about a man played by John Cusack, who is an aspiring puppeteer who is unemployed, and he gets employed in this office to like file documents. And in the office, he discovers a portal into the mind of character actor John Malkovich. And the movie just gets weirder and wilder from there. This is one of my favorite screenplays ever. I think it is one of the most creative and fascinating movies of all time. It is hilarious and incredibly entertaining. And I think it is perfect for the pod. The time just feels right to do this one. I'm excited to see it again.
All right, interesting. I thought the way you started that nomination, Tony, you were going to say like Forrest Gump or Showgirls, but it ended up being John Malkovich. Interesting choice. So very different from the Sound of Music. So let's see what Connor has now.
Got something a little different. Now, I swear I picked this. I mean, I didn't pick this until we started the segment, but I did make my pick. And Tony, your choice is nice. But I'm going to pick something from 2002, the 2000s, directed by Spike Jonze, written by Charlie Kaufman, adaptation. Which, Tony, being John Malkovich, obviously it seems like his most quintessential movie, kind of the movie that made his name and all that. But everything that Being John Malkovich does, adaptation does better. And again, it has almost more restraint. It is less of this kind of over the top. Like, I think there's two Charlie Coffins. There's Anomalisa Charlie Coffin. There's adaptation Charlie Coffin, or maybe there's a different, I don't know. But to me, Being John Malkovich has too much of the weirdness. Or, I mean, the weirdness is interesting, but it gets a little bit too fascinated by its own like little weird touches. Whereas adaptation is just pure, just brilliantly funny, still just incredibly hilarious. Like meta commentary on, right? The premise is that we have Charlie Kaufman, Nicolas Cage plays Charlie Kaufman, trying to adapt this screenplay, or trying to adapt this novel, The Orchid Thief, which is this kind of best-selling New York Times, kind of meditation on the meaning of like life through this experience of this, big city like reporter who goes into like the wilderness of Florida and meets this mysterious man. Anyway, and Charlie Kaufman himself knows that the material is interesting but kind of cliche. He kind of feels like he's a bit above it, and it's about how he can't write the screenplay and the sort of the weird psychic issues he has to go through. And in fact, he's accompanied in the film by his evil like twin brother, who in very surreal fashion, almost like the double, ends up also becoming a screenwriter. Anyway, it's a very, very extremely hilarious movie. I think it's easily my favorite of all of his work. And I swear to God, I was not picking this to undercut Tony, but that is my pick. So you'll have to, it's a battle of the Kaufmans.
Yeah, you missed the memo, Kirk. All right, interesting choices. We got the Kaufmans, and we got Nazis and musicals on the other end. I'm throwing around different directions. I need some rebuttals. Who wants to start? You want to go in order?
We'll go in order. I have seen Being John Malkovich, have not seen adaptation. I remember it when it was nominated. I remember watching the Oscars, and the only things I saw were the little scenes they play for the nominations. That's really the extent of my knowledge of the film. I mean, it was kind of something I passed by for whatever reason, but would be interesting to see again. Being John Malkovich is extremely, creative and quirky, and I like it for that. And it's kind of pushes boundaries, pushes the viewers' boundaries as well, and conceptions, and that's always fun. It's very much a Tony movie. Sound of Music. What is there to say? I don't know. It's a fun one. It's a good one. It's kind of a little bit out of my wheelhouse, and sometimes those are the best episodes because I'm not so connected to one idea or another, but and more malleable, I guess, in my formulations. So,
all right, Tony.
All right. Well, as for the other two movies, so Sound of Music is 3 hours long, which obviously we've done long movies, but I'm not looking forward. It is.
What's your point?
I'm just not looking forward to watching that movie. I don't know. I don't know. There's other musicals I like so much more. I agree we need to do more musicals, but I'm not looking forward to watching that one again. I'm sorry. There's some great songs in it. Just not one of my favorites. And then adaptation's interesting because I have a very weird relationship with that movie. Like, I used to really love it, and of late, because I've become a little bit more of a Kaufman skeptic. I've kind of become a little bit disenchanted with some of his movies, and adaptation's one of those ones that I'm a little bit more skeptical about these days. And it's Connor says that Being John Malkovich is kind of too enamored with itself, or enamored with its own clever, weird things. That's kind of how I feel about adaptation. Almost, I almost feel like it kind of ultimately disappears up its own ass. But I will admit, it is a hilarious film. It's amazing to see two Nicolas Cages playing off of each other, and it is still good. Kirk should definitely watch it, even if we don't end up doing it. It's well worth seeing. So I have kind of a complicated relationship with it, but to me, like Being John Malkovich, that's like the original. I think it's such a classic. It's such a touchstone. It's such a one-of-a-kind movie too. Like, even among like Charlie Kaufman films and Spike Jonze films, there's no other movie that really compares to Being John Malkovich. And I think it's totally unique in movies, frankly. And it's a movie that I am endlessly fascinated by and always want to go back to. And I just think it would make for a really fun episode. I think it just fits squarely within our wheelhouse, and it just feels like it's different from what we've been doing lately, which those two statements maybe seem to contradict, but it just feels right on some level. I don't know if that is all persuasive to Anthony, but that's what I would say.
Let me just quick before Connor goes, I will say, speaking of time theft, Tony, you made us watch Night Moves, so I don't know if you have much ground to stand on. Anyways,
I think I wounded him a little.
Well, we get as long as Night Moves was, we'll get that extra amount of time to add on to a movie. Yeah.
All right, Connor. What do you have?
Yeah, this is tough because I have to say, Tony's right that, Being John Malkovich feels more definitive. Great example of like this, the unfilmable script that was passed around in Hollywood is, can you get a load of this? Someone actually wrote this thinking they could get it made, right? And it was made, right? And that's so 90s. But adaptation, I don't know. I love its spirit. I think Tony might be right that it's maybe in some ways it's more up its own ass because it's a little bit less, it's a bit more cynical, a bit more less sentimental. But to me, it's just like, it doesn't take itself that seriously, which is what I kind of like about it. But it's still really interesting. It still tries to get at, the kind of the themes of the book it's adapting, as well as, the theme of adaptation of blah, 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 blah. And so I do really like it, but it's tough. I have to say, I feel I was a little, I probably should have picked something else, but it's interesting at least to have this head to head. And as for Kirk, Sound of Music obviously is a classic. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much I can wring out of for this podcast. How much could I say about it? But it's been a while since I've revisited it, and I'm a little afraid of how we're going to deal with Rolf, the cutest Nazi there ever was. But anyway, that's all I have to say.
All right, interesting rebuttals, interesting nominations. There's pluses and minuses, I think, to each one. I've tended to be kind of like Tony. I think we've talked about this before, in becoming kind of an anti-Kaufman, or a Kaufman skeptic, I should say. So there's issues I've had with both. They're both at the same time classic male movies that you want to show your partners. So there's that for it. So I'm going to start by saying, Kirk, with The Sound of Music. I had a babysitter when I was around 5. And she had 2 VHSs at her house, Tarzan and The Sound of Music. And ever since then, I couldn't stand either movie because she would play them repeatedly, make me rewind them, and then play them again. So I refuse to acknowledge The Sound of Music as a presence in my life.
I got 3 VHSs because Sound of Music was split over 2
yes, it was.
VHS tapes.
I remember that with
so
the extra. No, it was a traumatizing event. I can't never stand that musical since. So I gotta throw The Sound of Music in the trash. Okay, so I've seen adaptation more recently, and I tried showing Shay this movie, and I got a few glares throughout the 2-hour runtime or whatever it is, but I still like it. I do. Being John Malkovich has the sort of David Foster Wallace, John Cusack character. So it's kind of a tough back and forth, but I think I got to be selfish though. And just because it's been least, or I haven't seen it, more recently, I got to go with Being John Malkovich. I feel bad for skipping over Connor. I think adaptation was a great choice. Against any other movie, it probably would have been my pick, but Being John Malkovich is our next episode.
All right, thanks, guys. Yeah, that's I'm excited. I think it'll be a good episode. I think adaptation would have been a great choice as well, and I think it definitely deserves an episode at some point. But no, I'm excited to do it. I'm excited to watch this movie, and I think it's castable, you can say.
Edelweiss, Edelweiss. Every morning you fuck me long and wide.
I'll have what she's having.